Okay, so you should have already watched the video that's the intro for the Prehistoric Aegean module, and also I go into the Cycladic art a little bit. So in this unit we're talking about Cycladic art, Minoan art, and Helladic art, all right? Cycladic being art from the Cyclades, the set of islands that are sort of loosely arranged in a circle in the Aegean. Minoan being what we're going to talk about in this lecture, and then Helladic being art from what is now the Greek mainland and the various cultures that inhabited that region in this time period. Okay, so let's talk about Minoan art history and myth. So the word Minoan is a derivative of someone's name. In this case, it's a king. So the king is a guy called King Minos. And remember in the introduction when I talked to you about how Homer, who is born in 750 BC, so later than the period we're in now, he's part of the ancient Greeks, and he is writing his epic poems. He's writing these stories about mythology and gods and monsters and heroes that come from the time that predated him, which is where we are now. And a lot of the ideas and entities that are described in Homer's work and other people's work at that time as well stem from artworks and people that existed in this time period, that actually existed, but their story is a little bit warped over time, okay? So Homer writes, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? So the Iliad is the story of the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. The Trojans are in what is now Turkey, so they're up kind of in the north shore of the Aegean, basically. In the let's see, what is the city called? It's Hisarlik, I believe, in Turkey, in modern day Turkey. Anyway, so Homer writes about this time that's sometimes called the Age of Heroes, all right? And in the 19th century in Germany, there's this guy named Heinrich Schielmann. And Heinrich Schielmann is a big fan of Homer. He's kind of an amateur archaeologist as well and classicist. And he starts thinking that maybe some of the myths in Homer's writing, referenced in Homer's writing, aren't actually totally fictitious. Maybe there's some little kernels of truth that they're based on. So he starts finding evidence that not all of these tales from this Age of Heroes were fiction. I don't want to sing his praises too much because he was pretty problematic in a lot of ways, but in one that concerns us pretty directly, he liked to excavate sites using dynamite, so he destroyed as much as he discovered, possibly more than he discovered. He does influence a later British archaeologist named Arthur Evans, who's kind of a student of his, or like follower of some of his ideas, and goes about his archaeological excavations and things in a kinder way, not so much the dynamite. Anyway, so he starts thinking King Minos of Knossos maybe was a real king that lived on the island of Crete. And so King Minos, you know the similarity between Minos and Minoan. So the group of people who lived on this island get named after this king, King Minos. Now, according to the mythology, King Minos was the son of Zeus and Europa, and he was the first king of Crete, and he had several children, one of whom was the Minotaur, which also is why Minotaur has the same thing as Minoan, Minos, right? They all come from his name. And then his one of his daughters is named Ariadne, who also plays a part in mythology. Okay. There's another king at this time called King Agamemnon, and he's the king of Mycenae, which is on the Greek mainland. So we're going to talk about them a little bit more when we get to the Helladic art. Basically, King Agamemnon is the brother-in-law of Helen of Troy. Helen is the face that launched 1,000 ships, so this is what the Iliad is about, right? And King Agamemnon commands the Greek forces in the Trojan War. Okay, so this king was an actual person. There probably was this actual war, but some of the elements of that that pop into the fiction are pretty fantastical and were sort of added, right? Okay, so we won't go into all of the mythology, but basically a lot of these words that you maybe recognize, because a lot of these pop up in pop culture from time to time. We have King Minos. He lived at Knossos, which is on Crete. We have King Agamemnon. We have the Minotaur. This is a still of the Minotaur as it appears in a video game. I forget which one. We have the Labyrinth, not the Labyrinth with David Bowie, which is another great 80s film that you should totally check out. But the Labyrinth was the maze made by Daedalus, who was in the employ of King Minos, against his will actually, and he was this brilliant inventor, and so he creates this maze called a labyrinth to keep the Minotaur captured inside, and it's under the king's palace. So Daedalus is the guy who creates that. He's also an inventor. He's also Icarus's dad. If you've heard about Icarus, who flies too close to the sun, that's his kid. Ariadne is King Minos' daughter, who kind of helps Theseus when he's going to slay the Minotaur. And then we have Theseus, who is Aegeus' son. Remember, we talked about him a little bit in the intro. So all of these things come out of this period. So let's look at kind of the truth, the real artifacts behind some of this. All right, so this is Minoan Crete. So you can see Knossos there. You can see that it's pretty close to Thera. We can see where Mycenae is on the Greek mainland. You can see where Troy is up at the top there. And then on Crete, we have several Minoan sites. It's not just Knossos, that was the capital, that was the big palace, but there are several different sites. And a lot of these are discovered by Arthur Evans, who's the British archaeologist who kind of takes up the work of Dynamite Guy Schneelman. And he excavates Knossos at Crete. He discovers this palace there, which we'll talk about more in a minute. He also excavates at Ohistus and Agia Triada. And then there's another site called Gornia on Crete, and it was actually discovered in between 1901 and 1904 by a woman named Harriet Boyd Hawes, who I like to mention for a couple of reasons. She's the first woman to direct a major archaeological dig, and she's an American. So she was the first American archaeologist to find something major in the Aegean, which is kind of cool because it was at the turn of the century in 1901, before women were allowed to do lots of things like this. Okay, so let's talk about where some of these words from mythology come from. Labyrinth, for example. So the symbol of the Minoan people, kind of their emblem, was a labrys. This is a labrys. It is a double-headed axe, okay? In the case of the Minoans, it's mostly used ceremonially. So labyrinth means house of the double axe, okay? So we have the labrys as the symbol, particularly of Knossos, but important to the Minoan people. And then, so the place where this comes from, the labyrinth, house of the double axe, and then labyrinth comes to mean maze, because there's this crazy maze that Daedalus made to contain the Minotaur. Okay, so we have a couple of different periods in Minoan art. One is the Old Palace, which ends in 1700 BC, because everything burns to the ground. Everything's made out of wood. And then we have the Late Minoan, which is also sometimes called the New Palace era. This is kind of the golden age of Crete, so this is where we're going to focus. It's considered the first great Western civilization, and so we have a lot of discovery here. So let's take a peek at this. This is the palace, the New Palace at Knossos on Crete. So when you look at this on the right here, this is the plan for the palace. It looks pretty crazy, right? There's a whole bunch of little bitty rooms. There's all these ruins that kind of have all these dead ends and all these little spaces, and it's very, very complicated. So this was a multi-storied structure. It had 3 stories of functioning rooms that were freestanding, and then 4 or 5 stories that were built into the cliffside. So it was this massive complex. And as it breaks down over time and becomes ruins, everything kind of collapses in on itself. And it was this very complicated complex. You can see the illustration below before. So the result is this thing that looks like this. That blank space in the middle is the big courtyard or forum. So when this is discovered by the ancient Greeks, and it's a ruin at that point, you can kind of see how they would think that this was a maze, a labyrinth, right? So this is where we get this idea that at Knossos there was this huge maze constructed for some reason. So then they tried to figure out why was this big maze constructed, and they're like, oh, it was probably to keep a monster locked up. So then we get the legend of the Minotaur from that. So based on the ruins of the palace at Knossos, that's where we get this whole legend of the Minotaur and Theseus coming to slay it and all of these things. So that myth basically is that King Minos ordered that every 9 years, King Aegean, who's the king of Athens on the Greek mainland, must pick 7 boys and 7 girls to be sent to Crete to be eaten by the Minotaur to appease it. Theseus, Aegeus' son, thinks that this is stupid and should stop. So he goes, and then the whole story with him not putting the sails down correctly, and so his dad doesn't know he's successful. But basically, Theseus goes, he slays the Minotaur, and then the second part of the challenge is being able to get out of the maze. Well, Ariadne, who's technically the Minotaur's sister, but she thinks he's a monster too, helps him by giving him some magic string that helps him find his way back out of the labyrinth. Okay. So what is this thing, the actual palace at Knossos, which was not really a maze, it was just a very large, kind of complicated structure. What was it made out of? Rough stones, so rough hewn stones that were coated in clay, so kind of like an early version of adobe. It also had wooden columns, so let's look at some of these. So this is the palace at Knossos. This is part of the interior, and then we have part of the exterior. Now, there were paint fragments here, but this has been restored. These wooden columns were restored by Arthur Evans, not in a super necessarily accurate way. So you have to take some of this with a little bit of a grain of salt. But we can see these structures are pretty advanced. This was a very advanced multi-level kind of engineering piece, which is pretty rad. Okay, so now we're just going to look at some of the rooms at Knossos and some of the frescoes. Okay, so, where are my notes on the frescoes? Okay, here we go. So, we have here the throne room, so called because of the throne that's kind of built into the area. And we see on the walls these really well-preserved frescoes in this kind of bright red color that we see a lot in the Minoan culture. And we have these griffins, these fictitious beasts that have eagle heads and lion bodies. And they're also very stylized the way they're painted, which is kind of interesting. Let's look at some other examples. So we also have the bull leaping fresco and La Parisine. So these, oh, by the way, these are fresco, not fresco secco like we looked at in Egypt. These are fresco buono, meaning that they were painted while that coating of the stone was still wet for the first layer, so they kind of fuse into the wall, and that's part of why they're so well preserved. So La Parisine, this is the fresco on the right, and it means the Parisian woman. She's not actually Parisian, she was a Minoan woman, but she's very fancy. She's fully made up, she has jewelry, she has her hair all done, she's wearing this kind of elaborate outfit. So Arthur Evans called her La Parisine, because where do fancy ladies come from? Well, they come from Paris, okay? So she's very interesting, and because the color bound in with the plaster, with the coating of the stones, she's pretty well preserved. We can see she's not totally accurately proportioned. Her eyes are pretty large, but this is a more realistic portrayal of a woman from this period than we see in some other parts of the world, which is interesting, and it's pretty detailed. If we look at the bull leaping fresco, we have bulls were very important to the culture of the Minoans, so they appear in a lot of their art from this time period and seem to have served sort of a ritualistic kind of purpose. One of the interesting things about these frescoes is the women tend to always be painted as being very light-skinned, and the men tend to be painted as having dark skin. And the thought is that this was sort of an arbitrary denotation to show who's male and who's female, because it's kind of it's an interesting thing to consistently be portrayed in that way. We also have a lot of abstract patterning around the outside, which is pretty advanced for this time period. So what's happening in this image? We have a young woman grabbing the horns of the bull while a young man leaps and does a flip over it. Okay, so this is a kind of coming of age ritual where young men had to run and jump over bulls. While it's thought that these were maybe priestesses who were helping distract the bull during this ceremony. Okay, let's look at the sarcophagus. So as we know from having looked at Egyptian work from Egyptian tombs, we know that we have a lot of information from burial rites, right? So the same thing is true for the Minoans. So this is a sarcophagus. What's a sarcophagus? It's a coffin, basically, right? So it's where the body would have been encased and then laid to rest. So on this sarcophagus, we see funerary rites to honor the dead. Does this kind of remind you of anything? The Book of the Dead, right? Kind of like the Book of the Dead that we looked at when we were talking about ancient Egypt. So there's this belief basically for the Minoans that there's Aegean, which is this island beyond the sea, and that's the good place to go when you die. So on here we have depicted the funerary rites to show kind of how it's kind of like their Book of the Dead. It's the instructions for what you do in a funeral rite to make sure that person goes to Aegean, goes to the good place. On one side, we have 4 women and a man playing the flute, and they are tying an ox to a table. So that's in the upper right. So we have a man playing a flute, and then we have these 4 women who are tying this ox or bull down to a table. And on the other side, we see some men carrying things, right? They're carrying offerings. These are most likely sacrificial offerings that would have been part of the burial process. So they're carrying several, it looks like young bulls, young calves, and also a model of a boat. Why is there a model of a boat? Well, the Minoans, seafaring was a big part of their culture. It's an island, right? So all of their trade, all of their like battling with other groups of people is all done by sea, right? Fishing is a big part of their culture. A lot of things relate around boating, building boats, and traveling by sea. So it makes sense that you need a boat in the afterlife, right? To get to this island beyond the sea, you gotta have a boat for your soul to get there. So of course they're gonna give this dead person a boat. You also, if you look to the very left of this lower image, you'll see 2 labrys, so 2 double-headed ceremonial axes. Okay, and we see women also carrying and pouring liquid between these 2 ceremonial labrys axes. The liquid is likely blood from the ox or bull that was tied down and was ceremonially slaughtered. That was depicted on the other side, right? We also have another woman in this image who's playing a harp, and you'll notice that there's also a statue at the very right side, this shorter figure that doesn't have arms or legs. That's likely either a statue of a god who they're bringing these offerings to on behalf of the deceased, or it's a statue that's supposed to represent the deceased themselves. Okay, and very vibrantly colored. All of this is very vibrantly painted. So here's a close-up of that image so you can kind of see what's going on here. Okay, so now we're going to hop over to Thera. All right, so we have a lot of really well-preserved frescoes in Thera. I'm actually going to stop here and I'm going to come back. I'm going to section this off and make this its own section so that this isn't so long because we're getting a little bit long here. So I'll come back and talk to you about this fresco on Thera.